I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This is advertised as a 200Hz monitor, but that isn't its native refresh rate. It's natively 165Hz monitor. And then there's this little overclock feature in the OSD, which will bring it up to 200Hz or unlock 200Hz refresh rate option. However, that isn't guaranteed to work at all on your system or with your unit. It's usually the unit that's the issue, that is to say the monitor itself. So with my system, RTX 3090, I've connected it with DisplayPort 1.4. I've also connected it with HDMI 2.1, and it doesn't support 200Hz at all without frame skipping, either way. And this is significant frame skipping. I can see that with frame skipping tests, but I can see that when I'm just moving the mouse on the desktop, if I'm playing a game, it's extremely obvious. It just stutters, even at a very solid 200 frames a second, or what should be 200 frames a second from the system output. So in my case, this isn't working at all. And I've spoken to a few others, a user and a reviewer, and they have had similar issues with the monitor not actually running at 200Hz without frame skipping. If you do happen to get it to work without frame skipping and you want to use it, you will lose access to Pure XP, which is the strobe backlight feature. You lose access to local dimming, and you lose any VRR, variable refresh rate support as well. If you're still thinking that sounds okay, because as a competitive gamer where 200Hz could be useful, you might not care about those features. However, what you will care about is the pixel responsiveness of the monitor, and as I'm going to explore, there are some significant weaknesses in this respect, and they occur at, well, 165Hz, they're definitely there. They're actually observable at much lower refresh rates than that, but at 200Hz, the pixel response requirements for good performance are actually massively increased. This simply can't keep up. So I've got the monitor running at 165Hz, my game's running at a solid 165 frames a second. You can see that in the top right, hopefully a little green number, but it's running solidly at 165 frames a second at the moment, making the most out of the 165Hz refresh rate. This does bring you some advantages. It gives you an increase in connected feel, so that describes how the monitor feels when you interact with it, the precision, the fluidity. It's also important that the monitor has low input lag with that in mind, and this one does. I measured around 3.5 milliseconds in this case. But it's of course not just about how things feel, it's also about how things look. And the 165Hz refresh rate is helpful in that respect. It decreases perceived blur due to eye movement. If you're not familiar with perceived blur as a concept, please do refer to the written review, the responsiveness section, where that's explored a little bit. There's also an article on responsiveness linked to there which explores this in more detail. But most of it comes from the movement of your eyes as you track motion on the screen, and as you increase the refresh rate, and your frame rate also increases, you get a decreased perceived blur due to eye movement. But in terms of the visual responsiveness, it's also very important to consider the pixel responsiveness. So I'm going to jump straight into some pursuit photographs at 165Hz. Again, if you're not familiar with what pursuit photographs are, please refer to the written review and that article I mentioned where this is all explored. So you'll see here the monitor is tested with various response time OD settings. That's what they call the overdrive on this monitor. Standard, fast, faster, ultra fast and fastest. Confusingly enough, ultra fast and fastest seem to be the wrong way around. Fastest is the final option, the final overdrive option, and it's also the final option I show from this monitor because that's ordered correctly. However, ultra fast is somehow faster than fastest in terms of the response time and the level of acceleration. Makes no sense whatsoever, but that's how they've done it. Anyway, they might as well have given these numbers less confusing, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, and also swapped around ultra fast and fastest. But you can see significant weaknesses. There is a lot of smeary trailing, particularly for the dark background, which is the top row, but quite a bit for the middle row as well. The best performance, the best balance when you observe a broader range of transitions in this comes from the faster setting. If you go up to ultra fast, there's a lot of overshoot even for the transition shown here. With fastest it appears okay with a bit of overshoot, but does cut down on the smeary trailing a bit. Doesn't completely eliminate it, at least on these transitions. But when you're actually playing a game or just observing a broader range of transitions, you'll find that there's some extremely obvious overshoot even using this fastest setting, which remember is actually the second fastest setting. Really weird, I know. So you're not really going to want to use that, and I will try and show you some examples in-game of this, just so you can see what I'm talking about. Really obvious bright halo trailing, rather colourful as well. So you're going to really want to use the faster setting. And if you compare this to the reference screens, we've got the CQ32G3SU and the Gigabyte M27Q. So that's an AOC model, the CQ32G3SU. The AOC model is basically an average or slightly above average VA performer, and that actually comfortably outperforms this ViewSonic. The M27Q is certainly not the fastest IPS model out there, but it's at a level which many people are very comfortable with. That very comfortably outperforms the ViewSonic in terms of pixel responsiveness. So yes, there are definite weaknesses. It doesn't affect all transitions in the same way. So this is mainly medium to brighter shades with some darker shades mixed in, this kind of scene. And it's not too bad in terms of its pixel responsiveness. There is a sort of mask of extra perceived blur using my preferred faster setting, but it's not extreme. It's not sort of smeary trailing all over the place for this kind of scene. I can certainly see some more extended trailing, which I describe as smeary for some of the dark red materials with the wall in the background there. Also up here, where you've got this sort of shadowy area of wall with the sky in the background, some smearing there as well. I'm actually just going to quickly show you the fastest setting, which remember is actually the second fastest, just to see if I can show you some overshoot even in this scene here. And I certainly can. It's very obvious to my eye. Basically all around the edge of the wall here with the sky in the background, there's this bright cyan fringe, which is very eye-catching, very bright, really obvious halo trailing. You get it around the trees as well. So you might not have seen this with Test UFO, the pursuit photographs. It didn't really come out for those transitions so much. But when you're just playing the game, and I can see this sort of dirty trailing around the clouds there as well, which is darker than the background, so stands out in a weird way because of that. There's just loads of overshoot. So really, most people are not going to want to use this setting at all. Back to using my preferred faster setting, and I'm showing you a different scene. This has a lot of these high contrast transitions which the monitor struggles with. Lots of dark shades in the mix now, against medium to dark backgrounds or somewhat brighter backgrounds. And there is obvious smeary trailing around the flag there, around the boats down there. And you don't have to circle the mouse like this to see it, by the way. I'm just doing that to try and highlight it more in the video. You can see it with just more linear motion as well. And just when you're playing the game in general, this greatly increases your perceived blur if there are dark shades involved. You can see it around the flag there as well, and the tree, around the makeshift roof here, all the usual places. And actually a particularly extreme example, I'm not sure how it'll appear on the video, you'll be able to see this sort of watery effect around the dark areas of the building there, the little pegs on it at the top there, and the window further down as well. Quite messy. I like to liken it to wetting a page with water-soluble ink on it, and it kind of runs, the ink runs onto the page. Some of the colours separate out, so you can get different shades in the mix as well. Cyan, red, magenta, whatever it might be, contained within those dark shades can leach out. I think you get the idea. It has some clear weaknesses. Another way these weaknesses can manifest is with a sort of blending together during movement. So somewhat brighter shades can darken a lot during movement, like you can see with that bush here. And actually, even the rocks with the shadow detail around the bush, you can see this a bit. You can see during movement things blend together. When the movement ceases, it brightens up, as shown as it should be. So with little movements, this can appear as a sort of flickering effect. I'm just on the desktop. I just like to show you that these issues can occur when you're on the desktop as well. It's not just when you're gaming. So here you've got mainly dark content against a bright white background. Aren't really any particular issues of note here. Well, I mean, there are, but they're sort of isolated. So for example, within the image itself, mixed contrast transitions, much as I was showing you with the game before. So when you scroll, you can see some of this smeary trailing in places, but the text is not too bad. There's not like a heavy smear around the text. So this particular transition, black with white background or light grey background, is performed okay here. Switching over to the dim setting, there are some more distinct weaknesses now. Some smeary trailing. I'm not sure how this will come across on the video. It'll be quite obvious if I move the window in this fashion. The more distinct issues, at least with Twitter, this is just an example. You'll have plenty of other web pages and other applications where you'll notice various different issues or might notice various different issues. The lights out mode. So now you'll see this flickering I was talking about with the bush. It occurs with the grey text as well and the grey icons with the black background. So there's some distinct weaknesses here. So it doesn't really manifest as smeary trailing here, depends on the movement type, but it's really just that flickering where things disappear then reappear. It also depends on your scrolling behaviour though, so I was showing you Firefox just then. I've now switched over to Google Chrome, and that seems to by default scroll a larger section of the screen at once, so you don't really get distinct smeary trailing, and you don't notice that sort of flickering here because of the scrolling behaviour. And it may depend on how you set things up in Windows as well. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But I would say that just generally scrolling even the more troublesome content here is not particularly problematic. But you do have to remember that if you've got high frame rate animations, or depending on the web page, there may still be some issues. And certainly when you're moving windows about, or if you're doing that kind of thing on the desktop, then some more distinct weaknesses can be apparent. And I'm now on Gigabyte's website. This is a nice example of some clear pixel response time weaknesses, some real torture transitions which this monitor does not like performing. And this is on Google Chrome as well, by the way. It seems to be different scrolling behaviour here just because of this website, and I don't really know exactly what determines it, to be honest. It's not really my area, but I'm just showing you what I'm observing here. Yes, definite weaknesses when you scroll and when you move around here. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, bet you weren't expecting that, and I'm running the monitor under HDR. The reason for that is that things appear a bit different under SDR and HDR, and well, things appear very different, but in terms of how the weaknesses in pixel responsiveness can manifest, there are some differences to be aware of. So I didn't really talk about overshoot under SDR. That's because it's not really an issue that catches the eye using my preferred faster setting under SDR. I mean, there's some isolated halo trailing, that means it's a bit brighter than the background, but there aren't really any issues that jump out at me, and that's why I didn't show you them. They wouldn't have been very obvious in the video anyway, so not super bright overshoot or anything like that. And really the weaknesses there in terms of overshoot are far less apparent than the weaknesses when it comes to the smeary trailing. The weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, the slow pixel responses. You definitely get a lot of that under HDR. It doesn't suddenly become a non-issue. In fact, under HDR, you have to remember that you're going to have a lot of high contrast transitions, a lot of these very dark shades with brighter shades mixed in. So yes, smeary trailing is certainly an issue under HDR. This is quite a bright scene, but even then there are some mixtures of shades. See a lot of what I've been talking about. You probably would have picked this up in the HDR section as well, these weaknesses, although I wasn't specifically talking about them. But overshoot is also an issue in places under HDR. So remember that there's higher brightness, so this can become more apparent. The transitions being performed have changed, so the darker shades are actually quite a bit darker. Also under HDR, the monitor has to push the pixel transitions a bit faster, particularly in this case because it's using local dimming. And if you activate local dimming on its own, some of this can become apparent as well, these weaknesses. But really under HDR, it's sort of another level of apparent overshoot. Hopefully you can see this on the video. Sort of flashes of colour here, kind of a green or cyan trail around here. Also, you can see some magenta as well when I zoom in, actually. Very pretty, but not really what you want to see. I've just switched over to the fast setting. This does tone the overshoot down a bit. Still there, but it's not as obvious. And just in general, I prefer using fast for HDR and faster for SDR because of the overshoot. It does mean that you get a bit more smeary trailing, but to be honest, it's really something that you can notice with either setting. And just the overshoot on top using the faster settings a bit too much in my opinion. But please do experiment yourself and see which you prefer. But it is a little bit annoying that you can't just have one set and forget setting for HDR and SDR in this case. I'm back on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about VRR, variable refresh rate. This monitor supports VRR via adaptive sync, so you can use that with AMD FreeSync for example, and also Nvidia's G-Sync compatible mode. And that's supported via HDMI and DisplayPort. some quirks to be aware of. If you are using adaptive sync or want to use adaptive sync, you have to actually have what's called AMD FreeSync Pro enabled in the OSD, and for some reason that locks the brightness at a very high level, actually higher than the default under SDR, so it's around 500 nits it'll lock it at. It could vary a bit between units. I've seen some people actually record a little bit higher, some reviewers, with the FreeSync Premium Pro setting active in the OSD. So you need to have that active even if you're not specifically using FreeSync. You want to use Nvidia's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort, then you do need to have that setting active so you have locked high brightness. Really odd, really annoying. You can use HDMI 2.1 VRR as well, and that gives you access to Nvidia's G-Sync compatible mode, and you don't need that FreeSync Premium Pro setting active, which means you'll be able to adjust the brightness. Either way though, you get a very similar experience outside of that, and that includes a claimed 48 to 165 Hz VRR range, variable refresh rate range, but I actually found it generally was more like 55 to 165 Hz, and below that 55 Hz it switched to LFC, low frame rate compensation, or a similar frame to refresh multiplication technology, and that keeps tearing and stuttering at bay by ensuring that the refresh rate sticks to a multiple of the frame rate. So if, for example, the game was running at 40 frames a second, the monitor could be running at 80 Hz. And that's really what VRR is designed to do, get rid of tearing and stuttering, and it did that. It did that in much the same way with my AMD and Nvidia GPU. But now for some bad news. I'm running a VRR flickering test, and what this does, I will link to it in the description of the video, is it causes a cycling of various refresh rates quite rapidly, so it simulates significant fluctuations in frame rate, and with this model there's definite VRR flickering. This is causing, as I said, significant fluctuations, but you don't actually need these significant fluctuations to have issues with VRR flickering on this model. It's just very easy to show you with this test because it does that kind of thing. Not sure how this will appear on the video, but that kind of pulsing you can see for the, well, any shade really, sort of darker shades, it looks like a pulsing. You can see a bit of a flickering for the brighter shades as well to the eye. It is problematic. That is from the monitor. And VRR flickering is something which some models are prone to, VA monitors are particularly prone to it. I'm not going to go through the technical details. You can read the FreeSync experience section of the written review if you want to know a bit more about this. But definite issues here. If you're in the triple digits, even if your frame rate's rather stable, you still get this flickering from time to time. I wouldn't say it's extreme flickering in the triple digits, although I can still see it in the sky there in the background, even though my frame rate's quite stable, although technically it's double digits now because I've changed the graphics settings. But even when it's in the triple digits, I could see this flickering from time to time. But when you're in double digits, as I am now, it actually becomes more significant. It looks like almost like there's lightning in the sky sometimes, but that's not actually supposed to be there. So again, I'm not sure how this will appear on the video, but to the eye it is quite distracting. And I'm not super sensitive to flickering either, but in this case it was just too much, and there are those significant fluctuations, which doesn't happen so much with my RTX 3090, but can happen depending on the content and depending on your GPU and what's happening. Then really the flickering becomes rather intense. I didn't like to use VRR for this reason. For me, that's quite rare. Usually I'd keep VRR on even if there's a bit of VRR flickering, as you get with some OLED screens, for example. But in this case, just too much VRR flickering for me. But if you can stomach it and you're using VRR, I might as well continue to talk a little bit about the experience here. The good news is that there isn't extreme overshoot. I'm still using my faster setting, and the overshoot levels do increase a little bit, but it's again really the smeary trailing and the weaknesses associated with that which are the most eye-catching things you'll notice, or the most eye-catching weaknesses you'll notice. I've now locked the game at 60 frames a second, and even here I wouldn't say there is suddenly extreme overshoot. And I have observed this more broadly, not just on this scene, so I have looked at a wider range of transitions. And yes, there is a bit of an increase in overshoot, but nothing dramatic. And again, it's really the sort of weaknesses. Even at 60 frames a second, they are still rather apparent. They are less apparent. The pixel response requirements are massively decreased for a decent performance here. They're less apparent, but they're still there. still some definite smeary trailing in places. It might be that this monitor does use some degree of variable overdrive, but I think it's more that the acceleration levels are really low enough, even using the faster setting, under SDR at least, that it doesn't cause issues even at these lower refresh rates where that level of acceleration could potentially increase the overshoot significantly. But I do want to give the monitor a bit of credit because it might use some variable overdrive where things are retuned, and that is nice to see. It's just a shame about that VRR flickering, which for me again was just too much for me to enjoy VRR. And be aware that as your frame rate drops, you do notice a decrease in connected feel, and you notice an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement. And also, if you're frequently passing that LFC boundary, then there is a momentary stuttering which occurs. And that's not specific to this monitor. It's something which I always observe with adaptive sync. Just to reiterate as well that my experience with adaptive sync on my AMD GPU using AMD FreeSync was very similar, or FreeSync Premium Pro, very similar. Still had the VRR flickering in the same kind of places, the same kind of intensity, same VRR range, same kind of behavior. Another thing is this monitor does have a setting called Pure XP, which you can use if you're not using VRR. It's a strobe backlight setting. As I explore in some detail in the written review, it isn't very good. There's a lot of strobe crosstalk, significant weaknesses with pixel responsiveness which cause issues. Also overshoot in the mix there is more obvious, and it locks the overdrive settings. You can't do anything about that. Not that you necessarily want to, because then you're just going to get more smeary trailing. It's really smeary fragmented trailing when you've got a strobe backlight setting active. So I don't see very much utility in the strobe backlight setting, to be honest.